Now we're going to start looking at the electrical activity of the muscle contraction and the control features here. So although I did say that it is spontaneous, it contracts on its own, that spontaneity happens within this closed system. So even within the system, you still have nerve-like tissue that is sending signals down so that it can control the contraction, particularly the flow of the blood through the heart. So you have these four structures of the conduction system. You have the SA node, the sinoatrial node. And that's the pacemaker node. That's where the spontaneous pace is set. This is it right here. And then you have the AV node, the atrioventricular node, and that then is a relapse station for that. Then you have these AV bundle fibers that are coming right down the septum here. And then you have these branches that are coming up, these Purkinje fibers that go up the ventricular wall. So those are your four main structures. The next slide here kind of shows the same thing, but just in more detail within the structure of the heart. So here's your SA node at the top, and then you have the AV node right at the transition between the atrium and the ventricle. Here's your septum, the bundle branches, and then you have your Purkinje fibers that are going up. And the same image from your book here, it superimposes now just a timing, just to appreciate. You don't have to memorize these, but just to get an idea of how fast this is happening. This is showing things in hundredths of seconds. So the distance, the time it takes to get from the SA node down to the AV node is 3/100ths of a second. And to go from the SA node down to the outside is about 1/4 of a second. So that's the timing, just to appreciate how fast this is actually happening. And now this exists because of this particular blood flow. Remember that the blood in the atrium, both left and right, is being pushed down at the same time, and from here being pushed out. And this one single muscle has to contract in sequence to do that. So it's like a rhythmic type contraction that is dependent upon timing of blood filling and pushing through. And if this ever gets out of whack, you have issues. So if this is contracting and you're not pushing blood through at all, you're not getting enough blood flow to the brain or to the other tissues, and you're going to end up with tissue death. And that's why a lot of CPR really emphasizes AEDs or defibrillators. And you've seen this on movies where they say clear and they're going to shock someone. They're not restarting the heart. What they're doing is there's some mixed signal. So you're getting an erratic EKG signal. And what you're doing is you're basically resetting everything so that this can take over again. So basically rebooting your computer. And the SA node is the pacemaker. This sets the tone and it sends a signal. It's about a 1/10 of delay second to the AV node. From there, the signal kind of broadcasts down. So you're getting this contracting first so it can push all of its contents from the atrium down to the ventricle. And then boom, this contracts down through the septum. And so these guys can squeeze and then push that blood up through the pulmonary and the aortic valve. So very specific conduction for a very specific contraction, very specific timing. Now this electrical activity can be picked up in the chest through electrodes, and you get what's called the EKG or ECG, but EKG. And you have four parts, but three basic phases. You have the atrium's depolarization or contraction. You have then the repolarization of the atrium, like a reset. You have the ventricles that are depolarizing, and then you have ventricles resetting. Now, the reason why you only see three parts of the phases, you have the P wave, the QRS, and T wave, is that when you see the atrial depolarization, this is the SA node telling the AV node to contract. So you're getting the contraction of the atrium, pushing its contents down to the ventricle. You're getting the ventricle contraction through the QRS complex. And then you're getting a ventricle repolarization, like a recharge. You do get an atrial repolarization, but it's masked or hidden by the QRS or the ventricle depolarization. So you get atrial discharge, repolarization. At the same time, you're getting ventricle discharge, repolarization, and each one of this, lub-dub, is the valves closing, and you're getting contraction. So every heartbeat, so you can see it's like atrial contract ventricle, AV, AV, AV. You're getting the P, QRS, and then T. So again, you don't need to know too much detail about the EKG. I just present it as because you'll get exposed with the cardiovascular aspect. There's quite a bit that you can do with like EKG interpretation and understanding what you're meaning, but it's outside the scope of probably what you're going to be doing. And in the future, if you do take it, you'll take an EKG class for interpretation. Pacemaker node is set at 100 beats per minute. Normal heart rate is considered anywhere between 60 to 100 beats per minute. Anything above 100 is considered tachycardic or fast, and anything below 60 is considered bradycardic or too slow. Now remember, this is at rest, so this is like first thing in the morning you wake up, you take your heart rate. It doesn't mean, hey, you've been running around or walking all day on your feet, but when you take someone's heart rate, you can usually expect anywhere between 60 to 80 beats per minute for a healthy individual. Now, they might be a little higher, but for the most part, 60 to 80. This is influenced by the nervous system, particularly the parasympathetic and sympathetic. So if we have increases of heart rate above 100, what part of the nervous system do you think that's coming from? And hopefully you answered sympathetic nervous system, right? Your flight or flight system, right? You're either preparing for fight or you're preparing to run away. So your heart rate's going to start ramping up, anticipating a stressful type environment or in a stressful environment like exercise. Anything below 100 beats per minute, so down into the 60, 80, or even lower, is going to be driven by your parasympathetic nervous system, your rest and digest or rest and relax. So your heart rate can be influenced one way or the other. It can be as high as 250 beats per minute, and that max heart rate is the theoretical point where your heart's going to go from aerobic to anaerobic. And then your heart rate can get low, but if it gets too low, you're not getting enough blood exchange. And I don't think I've ever seen a heart rate below 40, but you can get someone's resting heart rate like 45, 50. But I actually am not sure what the lower limit of heart rate is. This next slide here kind of shows the input from the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So your primary parasympathetic nerve is the vagus nerve, and you can see that decreases heart rate below 100 beats per minute. And then you get sympathetic input that is increasing heart rate above. And so whether it's the hormonal system that's driven from the sympathetic nervous system or the parasympathetic, that's how you get these fluctuations either above or below 100 beats per minute. In this last part, we're going to look at the blood vessels, and we'll look at the arteries, the veins, and everything in between, which are the smaller veins and arteries, or the most important aspect, the capillaries. And so if we look at the circulatory vessels, so we'll look at the tubes that are carrying the blood to and from the heart, you have your primary veins, which carry blood back to the heart, and you have your arteries that carry blood from the heart. And where the gas exchange is actually happening, whether it's in the lungs or at the tissue, is at the capillaries. And the capillaries, this is the gas exchange. You do have these in between the capillaries and veins, these venules, and you have these arterioles that are in between the arteries and the capillaries. So you have your arterioles, the venules, then you have veins and arteries. But your capillaries are the business exchange. Your artery and veins are the primary sites there. So when you look at arteries and veins, arteries always carry blood away from the heart. So it's a very important concept. Is arteries carry blood away from the heart, veins always carry blood to the heart, always. It never changes. Where you get some discrepancy is when you're talking about the pulmonary system or the systemic system. Typically in anatomical drawings, you'll see the red depicted as oxygen-rich blood, and you'll see blue depicted as oxygen-poor blood. Sometimes people think that arteries always carry oxygen-rich blood and veins always carry oxygen-poor blood. And that's true in the systemic system, but it's untrue in the pulmonary system. Remember, veins always carry blood to the heart, so veins are going to the heart, and veins are always then going to the atrium, because that's where blood goes first. The atrium and then down to the ventricle. And when you look at the right side of the pulmonary system, this is sending deoxygenated blood. It came from the body, and now it's pumping this deoxygenated blood away from the heart. So it's actually carrying oxygen-poor blood through arteries to the lungs so that it can actually pick up oxygen, do the gas exchange, because the gas exchange happens at the lungs, not at the heart. So then that blood then comes, after it's picked up oxygen, comes back to the heart via veins. And then it's pumped through the system, and then you get the arteries carrying this blood, and then veins coming back. So in the pulmonary system, the arteries are actually carrying oxygen-poor blood, so those are usually depicted as blue, and then the veins are carrying oxygen-rich blood, which they're depicted in red. So just make sure you keep the distinction that in the systemic system, arteries are oxygen-rich and veins are oxygen-poor. In the pulmonary system, it's opposite. Arteries are oxygen poor and veins are oxygen rich. And so you have to kind of distinguish that, but always true, no matter if you're talking about systemic or pulmonary system, arteries are always carrying blood away from the heart and veins are always carrying back towards the heart. So you can see this schematic here. You can see the blood vessel. Things to appreciate is that you can see that Here's that smooth muscle that we were talking about earlier. You can see that encroaches around the entire vessel. Veins have it as well, but arteries have more. Arteries a little bit more thick. You can see the lumen on the inside. This is what gets damaged and oxidized, and where you get plaques or cholesterol. You can see one thing here that we'll talk about in the next slide. You can see that there's a vein that has a valve within the vein, and then here are your arterioles, here are your venules, and then here are your capillaries there that exchange. Again, cross sections, artery on the left, vein on the right. You can see this valve. So veins have valves, arteries do not. Veins do have a thin layer of muscle. Arteries have a very thick layer, so they have to resist more pressure, whereas veins are more elastic and compliant. Think of this as like a rubber hose, and think of this as like a balloon. So these don't stretch so much. They do have some flexibility to them, but these have quite more flexibility. And then when you look at the capillary, here's the transition point. You can see it's very thin. It's one layer thick with a little bit of a membrane, so it's not that thick at all, and there's not a lot of structure to it, and that needs to be thin so that gas can exchange back and forth. So again, here's your artery, your arteriole, your capillaries, your venule, and then the thick muscle, the smooth muscle, and then the one-way valve. And you can see here that the capillary is so small that you only can fit one blood cell in at a time. Again, another way to appreciate the thickness of the muscles here. Arteries are thicker than veins. Capillaries are one cell thin. You have the capillary beds that are exchanging tissue, and this makes up a bulk of the cardiovascular system. You have more bulk in veins and vessels. If you didn't have the chance when it came to the Museum of Science and Industry, and it does come back, you have what's called the Body Worlds exhibit. What they do is all the water in the body, the tissues in cadavers, they're replaced by some kind of polymer, and it cures and hardens, and then the rest of the tissue is dissolved away, and what you're left with is a perfect replica of that anatomical model or sample. So you can see the carotid arteries and all of the vessels that are going through the brain and the face. You can see the blood vessel density at the fingertips and through the arms, all through the lungs here, through the liver, spleen. And so you can see just how vast the circulatory system is and appreciate the number of capillaries that do exist. That's it when we look at the structures of the cardiovascular system. We've looked at the heart, we've looked at the blood vessels that are distributing, and we're looking at the route and path of which it's going. What we're looking at next is we're going to look at the blood, and particularly the blood flow and the cardiac output when it comes to exercise.